The fighter jet era has passed. Who's the clown who said that? More on that in a moment. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle Now, and this episode of Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com and our friends at the Patriot Post, who, when you subscribe at the Patriot Post, will now give you a free download of the Patriots Primer on American Liberty. Make sure you check that out in the description below. We'll provide a link right there. Bill, the clown who said the fighter jet era has passed. Any guesses?
Hang on. I'll recognize the name when you say it. Go ahead.
The last name starts with Musk. The first name begins with
Donnie
E.
Musk?
It's actually a product by Chanel, Elon Musk. And
Okay.
yeah, actually, Bill, speaking to a group of fighter pilots in Florida, fireside chat, Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, had with U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General John Thompson at the Air Warfare Symposium in Orlando, Florida. Elon Musk said that drone warfare is where the future will be. The era of the fighter jet has passed. And not that that's what he wants, he said, but that's just the reality. There are other things that he said during this symposium, Bill, that I'd like you to deal with. And for those who are watching us for the first time, Bill has a little bit of background on two aspects of this. Number one, he was a licensed or is a licensed pilot. And number two, he has just completed a massive series on the Cold War, which most of what we know about fighter jet air power is encompassed in that period of time. So just to set a little context for that. But Bill, what do you think of the idea of the fighter jet era being gone?
I think Musk is probably 70% right. In fact, given my extensive knowledge of aviation and technology, I would say he's 73% right. I think that the F-35 strike fighter, which is now actually operational, was incredibly troubled development and unbelievably expensive, which is mostly because of how we actually buy weapon systems. We're not going to get into cost plus procurement or any of the rest of it. But there was a period there 5-6 years ago when I was especially hard on the F-35 because it was so expensive. And there's a very widely publicized example of an F-16 1970s, late 70s era jet beating the F-35 in a dogfight. What we learned after several years, and which was quite informative and humbling to me, was that the F-35, number one, is capable of shooting missiles off axis. In other words, the entire history of air-to-air dogfighting is getting behind the opponent. Used to be you had to be up behind them enough to be able to get the shot with the machine guns. But as the operational cone of these air-to-air missiles opened, you could be more off-site, and then the F-35 doesn't care. The F-35 can have a guy right behind him, shoot a missile forward, turn around, and get the guy. We had a problem with this back in the 1960s when Robert McNamara and a bunch of other big brains said that we won't need guns on fighters anymore because air-to-air missiles will solve the problem, and we'll put out an airplane called the TFX, which eventually became the F-111. It was a flying school bus, and it was armed only with missiles. The early Vietnam jets didn't have any guns at all. The missiles were terrible, and we paid for it. The missiles are much better now. So let me just kind of use that to set up why I think he's 73% right. I don't think we're going to be building another manned fighter, a person-carrying fighter jet, for a very long time. It's possible we won't build them again ever, but I suspect that's not the case. What the operational decisiveness between a drone and a piloted airplane are. The disadvantage is that do you have software that is capable of making real-time decisions to the degree that a trained human can in terms of situational awareness? Is it jammable? Is it corruptible? All of that stuff. That's the downside. The major upside for unmanned aircraft, meaning the end of fighter airplanes as we know them, is that for some long time now, certainly since the F-15 and F-16, the ability of that aircraft to turn in combat is not limited by the thrust of the engine or by the strength of the airframe. Since the fourth generation jets at the end of the 70s, the ability of a jet to turn in the air is limited by the pilot. In other words, modern jet aircraft, even as old as the F-15, F-16, can do a sustained turn of 9 Gs, at which point even the most highly trained pilot with the best, anti-gravity suits that keep the blood pressure in the legs high to keep the blood from sinking into your feet, all of that stuff together, you can do a 9G sustained turn for several seconds, and at which point the pilot breaks out, just passes out. The drones don't care. And because our material advances in terms of composites and so on, lightweight composites, very, very strong composites. What Musk is basically saying is that from this point forward, all fighter aircraft required to take extremely complex and high performance turns and so on will be drones, because they can outturn a human pilot. And there are two other advantages to drones. One of them is they don't have to carry all of this life support stuff for pilots, including space for the pilot, including space for oxygen and then a clear canopy and all the rest of it, which means you can make them lighter, and you can also make them smaller. You can make their cross sections smaller because a pilot sitting up has a certain vertical space. So there are many, many advantages to drones, but I don't think he's completely right. I think the future clearly seems to be a case of hybrid. And we're seeing this already with the F-35. There is an order that I don't know if it's been placed or not, but we have, for example, we have the F-22 air superiority fighters, the best in the world, but we only have like 120 of them. We have built and are continuing to build large numbers of F-35s with these incredible sensor suites that are able to detect everything. But the future, and this is where Musk is mostly going, I think, the future is not to think of this as this is a great fighter airplane. The future of air combat is to understand what the Air Force understands, Navy understands, U.S. military understands better than anybody in the world, and by far, is that this is no longer a question of we have an Army, a Navy, an Air Force, Marines, Space Force, Coast. No, we have a United States military, and we have various assets, which would be weapon systems, sensor platforms, refueling tankers, and all of this. And the future, which we are executing today in this country and only in this country, consists of understanding that the battle space is a three-dimensional area, and that all of the assets inside that area, including tanks on the ground, soldiers on the ground, satellites in orbit, all of it, submarines, they're all talking to each other. And so an F-35, which has probably the most advanced sensor suite in the world. Well, there's no question it does. It absolutely does. You can send a very high value asset like an F-35 into the battle space, and the sensors on that F-35 will be able to detect where enemy air threats are, at which point the F-35 could then direct unmanned drones to go in and clear that airspace. They can maneuver more effectively than he can. They're under direct human control. They can stay in the air for as long as they want to. And then basically, after the airspace has been cleared, that same fighter can then direct traditional F-16s or B-52s for that matter, or whatever, and then bring in air power and air-to-ground attacks on that. Last thing I'll say is this. One of the planes we may be seeing in the future that will have the most impact on actual war fighting may look something like a 767. In fact, it may be a 767. It may even be an unmanned 767. Because if you have stealthy, highly survivable, extremely well-censored air assets in the front, and then you use these assets to direct drones to the most dangerous areas, then basically what you do is you just take a 767 and load it with, I don't know what they'd carry, 2,000 bombs, 2,000 1,000-pound bombs with GPS warheads, and it just flies over the country and just drops the bombs. And all of this stuff is only being done by the United States. It's not to say we're the only country with the technology to do it, although I suspect that's true too. But the most important part of this equation is, I'm so glad to get an impeachment. The question is not about Bernie or impeachment. But the key to this, and the reason why America is doing it and can do it, and I don't think anybody else can, is that for this entire theory to work, you have to have a political and cultural theory about society that we have and China doesn't have and Russia doesn't have and nobody else out there has. For this idea of an integrated battle space to work, essentially what it means is you have to be willing to risk your entire asset, let's say on an airstrike. You have to be willing to have that asset, all of these jet fighters, multi-billions and billions of dollars of fighter airplanes, nuclear submarines launching, cruise missiles, all of this stuff. I'm simplifying a bit, but not by much. You have to, as a culture and as a military, be willing to let a private or a sergeant who's on the ground with eyes on the target and a means of communicating that target's position. You have to have a society that trusts that sergeant or private enough for him to say, I've got a target, I've got him in sight, it's definitely hostile, let's hit this guy. What you find in cultures like the Chinese culture, Russian culture, and so on, that kind of decision-making simply is not, it just doesn't, they won't allow it. They won't allow an NCO to call in an airstrike because it's just an NCO. That's the job of a general to make that decision. The modern battle space moves so fast, and we have so many assets that not only do we need the technology to link all of these things together, but we also have to have the human confidence. And I am unbelievably impressed with American top-level Pentagon thinking on this, which usually is so hidebound and dusty. These guys are in the far forefront of this, where they're saying, we don't go as an Air Force or as a military, as a Navy. We go as the United States of America, and we deploy this unbelievably sophisticated sensor net, which determines targets, and then we assign the correct assets. I know this is long-winded. I'll just close this little section by saying the modern problem in conventional warfare, given guided munitions, the problem is not hitting the target. That's no longer a problem. It hasn't been a problem since the Gulf War. The problem is finding the target. And the problem is finding the target and then being able to attack the target in time so that the target hasn't moved or concealed itself or gone into a civilian area or whatever the case may be. And nobody does this like we do.
So, Bill, you covered several of the points that Elon Musk discussed during this symposium, and I'll just reinforce one of them. That doesn't surprise me, and why he was there and not you, I have no idea. But a couple of points just to reinforce. Musk said basically that he believes that the F-35 Joint Strike Force fighter should have a competitor, that we should foster competition as far as what is the superior air strike capability device, if you want to call it that these days. And that competitor should be a drone. He envisions that being remotely piloted with artificial intelligence augmentation to allow it to be flown remotely, but with the ability for the computer to do things that the a human pilot from a distance would not do. And he said the F-35 would have no chance against it. Now, to get to your issue of nobody doing this, one of the things that Musk brought up during this symposium is that China will, at some point in the not too distant future, have an economy twice as large as that of the United States of America. And typically, large economies have an advantage in fighting in war. And he said because the United States won't be able to outgrow on the sheer basis of population, that the United States needs to be able to out-innovate. But the question politically that occurs to me is, what will the people of the United States of America say about the idea that you have a bunch of AI-driven, augmented reality, perhaps remotely piloted devices out there that are making killing decisions on our behalf?
This is a much better and different question, but basically the fear, and I share this fear because this is not a technological issue, this is a moral issue. At what point do non-piloted assets and remote-controlled vehicles turn into Skynet with their hunter-killers, gunning down humans without humans being in the loop?
And where's that Skynet reference from? For those who are ignorant like me,
from Terminator, the world where humans build an intelligent, an artificial intelligent defense system that then becomes self-conscious, self-aware, and just tries to kills all the humans. We have had the technology that he's talking about for probably 20 years now. Just to give you a quick example, most everybody's familiar with the Predator drones, which are now the Reapers, and they continue to get more advanced. And they were originally a reconnaissance platform, and they still serve in that role. But early on, they figured out if you took a very light missile like a Hellfire missile, you could put one on each wing of this reconnaissance drone, and you could pop them off and reach out and touch somebody. And since the drone itself is so lightweight, and the original ones had just a propeller engine driven by gasoline, they were virtually invisible and inaudible. And these Predator drones became more effective, and they started to increase the production and sophistication of them. They're flown, I think, almost universally from a location in, I want to say it's in Nevada. I'm not 100% sure about that. Telecommunication satellites take the data from the drone, and you have a pilot of the drone. The drone has a pilot. He's just not in the airplane. For all intents and purposes, his consciousness is in the airplane, and this is where Musk is mostly going with this. But if I'm sitting at a console and I'm looking at a series of computer screens and I'm flying traditional controls, I've got a throttle and stick and stuff, and I'm looking at screens, doesn't really matter if I'm in the aircraft looking at a screen or across the world looking at the screen. So my point about what you were talking about in terms of robotic death machines is we never, to my knowledge, and I've been in CENTCOM while CENTCOM was at battle. They had to clean up, sanitize the room before I got there, so I didn't see any, secrets. And then they had to sanitize the room after I left because I was so impressed.
And let me just clarify for a minute, Bill, because I raised the moral question. It's not in the article at CNBC.com that I read. I understand,
but it's a key issue. To my knowledge, there has never been, ever, not once, any automated drone system that has launched a strike against targets, at least targets with people in them, that was not explicitly authorized by a human being. And when I say a human being, I don't mean a guy eating a sandwich in the back. Sure, why not? When I was at CENTCOM, where most of the action is, the Central Command is Afghanistan, Middle East, and Iraq, Iran, all of that. When I was at CENTCOM, if they had a lead on an asset, or a target, if there was a high-level terrorist, let's say, and they had a picture of him, had a live picture of him, and they said, we need to get this guy on our targeting list. That decision then had to go to at least a brigadier general, definitely a general grade officer. He had to consult with CIA and other people. There were, in fact, devil's advocates whose job it was to say, no, don't do this. And they had to talk pretty fast because this guy's in a car and he's going from one place to another. He's not going to be out there all day. But the idea that somebody just pickles one of these things off the rails and watches them go boom, no. This is taken exceedingly seriously. And the mechanism for making these decisions is pretty well greased. The intelligence guys know who they're looking for. The targeting guys know who they've got. And then a high-level military human being makes the decision, which is then executed downstream by humans flying the drone and so on. But we've also had a reconnaissance drone for a long time now called a Global Hawk, much, much bigger than a Predator. It's got kind of a bulge on the nose. It's a big aircraft for drones anyway. And this thing can stay in the air for, I don't remember what the number is, I want to say 7, 8, 9 days. And frankly, Global Hawk is so internally self-aware that this does not have a human pilot. Can be flown by a human pilot, but basically for Global Hawk, you can start it up in your hangar and get to a computer and say, okay, fly to Sydney. Just fly to Sydney, and it'll just do it. And tell, oh, by the way, circle over Hawaii for 3 days on the way out there. No problem. And because it doesn't have to carry human supplies in terms of oxygen and so on, and especially in terms of food and crew fatigue, it doesn't care. It's up there forever. So Musk is 73.5% right. Yes, a great deal of the military air assets in the future, as well as surface and submarine assets, as well as land assets like robotic scouts and things of this nature. Going to be more and more of this is going to be unmanned, and that's good. We don't want our people getting killed. But at the same time, we don't want a system where the artificial intelligence is making the decisions, because artificial intelligence can often be superior to human intelligence in terms of gathering information and even organizing information. But what artificial intelligence cannot do, and I don't think we'll ever be able to do, not because it's a technological issue, but because I think it's beyond the realm of technology. And that is that artificial intelligence will never be able to make a moral decision. They'll never be able to make, at least not in, no, I don't think they will ever be able to do it. I think that the nature of silicon precludes the ability for a machine to be able to look at a targeting situation and say, I don't know, that just doesn't feel right. And I'll wrap this up by giving you one specific example of this. At the end of the Gulf War, the first war, the Iraqis had gone in and simply raided Kuwait, done an awful lot of raping, a lot of murdering, and a lot of stealing. And once the ground war was essentially won, virtually all of the Iraqi units that were in Kuwait decided to make a run back to Baghdad as fast as they could. And they made a sizable convoy, hundreds and hundreds of trucks and cars that were racing on this highway back to Baghdad with all of their stolen loot. So airstrikes were called in against this. These were military assets. These were soldiers in uniform with weapons returning to Iraq so that they could fight again. And once it was discovered that this convoy was on its way, massive U.S. military assets were deployed to stop it. And of all the things that our Air Force is designed to do easily, I would say killing ground targets like tanks and trucks is what we do best. So we launched a series of airstrikes against this convoy escaping Kuwait. And it later became known as the Highway of Death. We put some aircraft in there. We shot up the front of the column. That meant nobody could get around it. We shot up the back of the column, and then we started to shoot up the column. And we did that so effectively that as continuing waves of airstrikes continued to come in and press the target, American aviators just said, no, we don't. No, this is shooting. It's not necessary, and it's not right. We have completely decimated this column, and we stopped the column. That was our job. But to go in there and just to continue to massacre people who, to be honest with you, Scott, really kind of deserved it after what they had done to the civilian population of Kuwait. They just said, no, we're not going to do it. We're going back. And time and time again, we see this in the military. And as I was mentioning at CENTCOM, time and time again, you have human beings there, American citizens, who've had to watch through the eyes of a recon drone, and not in the blurry kind of black and white or green and white that we saw in the Gulf War. I'm talking about watching on giant screens, which I've seen with my own eyes. I've seen the screens anyway. Full color, high definition images of some of these savages in ISIS raping and murdering women. There are no weapons on that observation platform anymore. They just have to watch it. And when they make a decision to put a rocket off of those rails, they are guided constantly by the fundamental decency of the American people as represented in the United States military. And when they look at these things and see some of the atrocities that they've watched with their own eyes, and their all too human desire to get these guys, they will still look at this and say, we don't know if the third guy in that car is a civilian, a hostage, and they won't take the shot. And when we stormed bin Laden's compound, it was filled with civilians. And holding your fire in a split-second situation like that in the dark can get you killed. But we didn't kill those civilians. And that is a split-second moral decision made by human beings, decent and honorable human beings. And how you're going to write software to do that is a mystery that I don't even think Elon Musk can overcome.
Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. You can join those members, foster these kinds of conversations, and spread them around the world, plus access members-only content and the ability to write your own blog post at our members-only blog and engage in vibrant conversations and civil dialogue. Just click that Become a Member link at BillWhittle.com. We'd also like to thank our friends at the Patriot Post, who are now offering for free their new Patriots Primer on American Liberty that you can download when you subscribe at the Patriot Post. We'll provide a link in the description below. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.